as you might see today, we are starting a new type of video, a different type of video. I thought we've been discussing so much about theoretical things, that maybe it would be easier and better if we focused on the idea of physically writing a poem, of doing something different, of actually acting, right? It's one thing to talk about something, it's another thing to see somebody do it or do it yourself. And so today I thought we would focus on writing. What's interesting is we're going to focus on prompts because I think it'll be easier to write. Oftentimes we're not inspired or inspiration is not coming. We try, but it won't happen. So I found this prompt, and you'll notice that it's simple, seemingly simple, but not necessarily so simple once you get into the weeds of writing a poem, especially without inspiration, right? Oftentimes when you're passionate about something, when something comes up, it's much easier to write about. And that's the same with poetry, that's the same with fiction, anything really in your life, anything you're doing also, right? Not just writing, but anything you're doing, if you're interested, then you get more into it, and if you're not, it's harder. And so part of the issue is oftentimes we think of artists as inspired all the time, and there's a debate to be had about forcing yourself to write every day versus allowing inspiration to take over and only writing when you're inspired. That's a large debate. I'm not going to get into it today. The answer is really provided by yourself, how you think, quote unquote, a writer should be. There are those who argue, obviously, writing every day makes you a writer. But I actually don't know the answer. You have to decide that for yourself. And sometimes I feel like I should be writing every day. Currently, I don't write necessarily poems or stories every day. There is writing typically involved in work or something else, so you can also argue, what does it mean to write? Is writing enough just on its own? Is it the act of writing? Is it writing with a purpose? Is it writing art with a purpose? I don't know. You'll have to decide. But today we're going to focus on the idea of prompts and how it might look to think about a prompt and how to sort of force yourself into inspiration if it's not coming. So you'll see here there's already a prompt written down. I found this. And prompts open up two different things. As we said, because you're not inspired, it might feel harder to write. On the other hand, it does give you direction. And so one of the things you have to focus on when you get a prompt is, what is it asking you to do? And that's pretty open to interpretation. And that's why most good prompts are pretty broad, because to give a specific direction is actually going to make it much harder. There's a balance we've been talking about in the past between rules helping you write and rules that stymie your writing. And so you want a rule to focus on, which here is the prompt, but you don't want to give yourself too many rules. And you'll ask, well, you have rules right here, so how is that going to work? And we'll get there. But first, let's think about the prompt. The prompt that I found is to write about a color. Now, when you see something like color, obviously the first thing that jumps out to you is the idea of sight. Colors is something we see. Colors are something we see. And so the first instinct might be to think about what you see. I'm going to ask you to pause that kind of idea, and we'll get into a little more what that might look like and why you might not want to go with your first instinct. But first, I'm actually going to set up some rules, despite what I've been talking about with rules being limiting, just to help sort of balance the idea of prompt, which is enforced topic, and rules that I can make up, which can be the inspiration. Because they're from me, not imposed, I can use them to help inspire myself. So, as we've been talking about in the past, one rule we're going to have is 14 lines, because as we've mentioned before, the idea of 14 lines, a sonnet length, there's something there, right? There's three types of sonnets. Clearly they've been used for hundreds and hundreds of years, maybe even thousands. So the idea of 14 lines is good. The question then becomes, of course, do I impose more rules? I actually don't think I will. I think we'll leave it at 14 lines. So far we have color and 14 lines. Many people's instincts are now to think about title. How do I encapsulate what I'm about to do? I actually think title should be left to the end of writing. I often find that titles limit us in a negative way. If you find that it's different, you can use a title. But for me, titles are something that you can only use almost after you write the whole thing. Because how do you know what it's about? You, especially with a prompted piece of work, it's much harder to know, what am I going to write about? So obviously you could go with easy titles, color, what I see, something like that. And again, if a title helps you get started, then you should do that. But for me personally, I know that it does not. Titles I often have to give when I feel like I've captured the essence of a poem, because title really does introduce the reader and frame the poem or story for whoever's going to sit down and read it. And so I find that if I don't know where I'm going, then how can I prompt somebody? You could use the prompt as the title, right? If we're talking about how titles sort of make people aware of what's going to happen. And you could do that and it could work, and that might be great. But for me personally, I think we're going to leave the title alone for now, and we're going to think about writing about a color. And what I've said before is color often makes you think of sight. And so, again, there are easy ways to get into this, and there are more complicated ways. And this is all personal preference, as writing is personal preference, and how you write is your personal preference and how it works for you, and that'll be developed over time. Even if you've never done it before, you sort of have an instinct. When I sit down on a piece of paper, when I get write about X, you sort of have a first instinct. So whatever that first instinct is, that's what you're going to go with. For me personally, my first instinct is to sort of think of whatever the prompt is and try and spin it in a new way, in a different way, in something that's interesting to me. Again, if it's not interesting to you, it's not going to be interesting to whoever's reading. So for me personally, I'm going to think about color, but color not in a traditional way. So let's take out sight. Now we have other things called, the other four senses. You could also do emotional color, right? Blue is calm, red is anger or violence. And again, that's the simple way to do it. And so sometimes simple is good and sometimes simple is too simple. So again, if the emotional resonance or the physical attributes of color hit you and you're like, I can go with that, go with that. But for me personally, again, I'm going to try and twist it. And one thing to think about when it comes to these sensory or emotional poems is a medical condition, actually, randomly, that's called synesthesia. So what that is there are people in the world who do not process things as a quote-unquote typical person would process. And what I mean by that is, for example, you can taste what you hear, or you can see what you listen to in a very vivid, more vivid than imagination way. There is a physical response that doesn't correlate to the input. So the output is different than the input. So not oftentimes, but there are musicians who will talk about composing their music as if they're painting. And while we talk about that poetically, metaphorically, there are people who it's literally true for. And what that means is when they hit the key of E and they play the note A, they see blue. And when they hit the note G, they see the color red. And what they're doing is actually literally witnessing the notes pass in front of their eyes like colors. And so synesthesia is, while a medical condition, it's also helpful. And when you approach writing and you're trying to make something quote unquote interesting or exciting or different, trying to create new connections for yourself in order to broaden the base from which you write, you can think of it as a trick or tool to help you create something different. So the other thing you have to think about with a prompt like this is what color? Colors in general, specific colors, colors mixed together, paintings, right? Color sort of conjures up a lot of different images. And so again, you can see how, though there is a rule, you have to write about color, it still is very, very important for and open to allow interpretation. It's important to allow for yourself to allow the words or prompts to make your brain go into its creative space and its open space so that it can take the prompt and move in whatever way it seems to want to. Right now, color is sort of hitting the emotional resonance for me. And so I'm going to think about how color here can move through emotions. The other thing I'm going to do is try and make color less visual and more sensory, because I think there could be a nice parallel between how I'm feeling or feelings in general and the color being used. Oftentimes we think, again, as we were saying, that there is a color theory, right? That blue will calm you and red will make you angry. And that can be a nice way to start. And that might be the simple way here because, again, we're sort of limiting ourselves in the other ways, right? We're not trying to use color visually. We're not trying to allow for color to go into the typical routes. But we're going to start with something simple and go towards emotional resonance within that color. So here we go. I'm going to talk it out loud as I'm writing. Of course, this is a little different than how I usually compose, so I'm sure there'll be snags as I'm thinking out loud, as things are going on. And again, you have to think to yourself, how do I create the best environment for writing? For me, currently, obviously, this is a little different, but maybe that'll be good. It'll prompt me into something a little more strange or uncomfortable. And sometimes uncomfortability is where you find inspiration because, again, you see something different than you would have before, right? In a comfortable situation, sometimes we just see the patterns, our own patterns, emerge over and over. And here we want to think about how can we see patterns in a different way? How can we see colors in a different way? And so with that introduction, we're going to get into the writing of the poem in the next video, where we'll continue our ideas about prompts and how we go with them. If you enjoyed, please feel free to rate, share, and subscribe. And I'll see you in the next video where we move on to the writing portion.